Bonjour tout le monde, and welcome to a bit of an unusual follow-up to my last video, but at least I have a new mic this time, so hopefully it'll sound a little better. In the days since I recorded my first impressions video on Dark Deity, I managed to finish the game, and while my time with it isn't completely through thanks to the decently robust character customization and the extensive bond system, I feel like it's time to get out some of my thoughts on how well the game holds up as a whole, complete with light spoilers, so maybe don't listen if you're worried about those. Does Dark Deity carve out its own identity that will allow it to go down as a beloved indie homage to Fire Emblem? Or is it really too much of Fire Emblem with the serial numbers filed off? Well, it's kind of both. At least to an extent, anyway. Dark Deity does indeed invent enough of its own systems and mechanics to not come off as a total clone of its inspiration, in the same way that similar indie project Bug Fables plays very much like an older Paper Mario game, while introducing some enjoyable new gameplay elements and a distinctive aesthetic that allow it to stand out. I can't fault Dark Deity in that quarter, and something tells me that once all the bugs have been worked out, it'll be the hardcore modding types who hold on to this game the longest. If only because Dark Deity lets you do 0% growths and randomized recruitment and classes and all manner of other customizable challenge runs through its own menu options, without the need for hacking. I'm actually a little surprised that it's those types of fans who seem to be the most down on the game immediately post-launch, but to be fair, people who are into Fire Emblem and similar games, mostly for the tactical elements, are going to be the ones most critical of poor tactical design, glitches, and UI sloppiness. I think that the further they delve into the game, the more they'll find to enjoy, particularly when it comes to some of the creative chapter concepts later on and a few somewhat complicated maps. Not that complicated is necessarily good, of course, but let's just say that the criticism of late game being a bunch of unfinished-looking empty spaces is altogether inaccurate. Game balance is another matter, but when you consider that Fire Emblem games have never been balanced well, and that those issues are exacerbated as you dial up the difficulty, I feel it's a little inappropriate to be asking Dark Deity to do much better in that regard. I predicted this game will be something of a slow burn for Tactics fans after the initial rush and early reviews, and that they'll find more to take out of it as the developers polish it up and they find more to discover in its many customizable features. On the other hand, though, those primarily invested in transformative fandom won't have much to pull out of Dark Deity until they finish the game, and when it's less than a week old and didn't have a bunch of content data mined or fan-translated pre-release like was the case for every Fire Emblem title, there's just not been a lot to go off of. And, unfortunately, I regret to be in the position where I have to be the one to report on that, because for long-term fandom engagement, the prognosis on Dark Deity is rather grim. Early reports of the story feeling unfocused were premature, as it does eventually find its footing a bit past the halfway point, but in doing so, it essentially falls back in line with standard Fire Emblem plotting. There are some shakeups, the most obvious being that the evil ruler invading another nation rules over the protagonist's own kingdom, with the back half of the plot taken up largely by a revolution to depose him. That's not an angle Fire Emblem has ever really pursued, with the closest it's ever come to that being Part 1 of Radiant Dawn, or maybe how pre-release marketing of Fates represented the Conquest route, even though in actuality that's not really how Conquest is structured. Now, you may think from the description of Dark Deity's plot that it comes close to the actual political progressivism that some newer fans of Fire Emblem seem to want from these games. I recall a few months ago someone on Twitter suggesting that the next FE should center around a peasants' revolt, which was mocked pretty heavily for how thoroughly unlikely that would be. And Dark Deity goes to further prove that point in the end, even lampshading in its script how implausible it would be to convert a flawed monarchy into anything more democratic, while sticking to the pseudo-medieval confines of the game's setting. I don't think that's something most players are seriously looking for in a game like this, but just in case you got your hopes up because the main cast isn't a bunch of nobles, I'm here to tell you that the angle never gains much substantial momentum. Additionally, the last few chapters dip so heavily into the supernatural fantasy elements that it would be nearly impossible to read anything more into them, especially when all three of the game's major antagonists, including the tyrannical king, are so underdeveloped as to be nearly interchangeable in terms of the threats they pose. Moving over to the playable cast, the best way I can describe them would be serviceable, but without much to grab onto. As I discussed in my last video, auto-recruitment and the lack of permadeath work wonders for the character writing of Dark Deity, with even relatively minor characters getting to contribute to plot points or just make their feelings known during the story. The bond system is indeed as robust as advertised, with 450 conversations between units, many of which are locked until you reach certain points in the story, which allows for a more natural integration of the narrative with character development on the side. All that sounds incredible, but like I said, the game is really sparing when it comes to the kinds of character hooks that tend to get the transformative FE fandom going. The overwhelming majority of bonds are platonic, and in some cases don't even really feel like they're fleshing out a friendship so much as provide additional lore dumps or backstory exposition. And the lack of even individual character endings leaves the epilogue feeling insubstantial, with characters getting only 2 or 3 lines of dialogue alluding to their future plans after the war. Also, despite it being advertised and somewhat hyped up pre-release, there's very little in the way of queer content, with the only substantial bit I noticed being a relationship between 2 female characters that was admittedly decently well done based on the parts of it that I got to see. I made a point to get every Bond conversation between male characters, and there's just nothing there, really. Ford's alleged bisexuality doesn't come up in any of them, nor does Elias having had a male love interest, and while you can maybe squint very hard and see Elias ending up with Ford or even the main character Irving in the post-game, based on where they all end up, even that would be a stretch. Maybe some fanfic writers can prove me wrong and pull a romance out of what's there in the script, but I'm having a lot of trouble seeing anything much less getting invested, and that lack of investment is what I mean for the dim prospects of Dark Deity in the long term. So, you can call this my hot take for this video, but it's a point that I think needs to be made. While it's not something that the fandom likes to admit openly, there's always been this quiet acknowledgement that Fire Emblem likes to feature a variety of, shall we say, unconventional romantic and sexual content. That's a broad enough umbrella to cover everything from queer subtext to marital infidelity to large age gaps to dancers who might actually be camp followers to dragons who look like little girls but they're totally legal, we swear, to obvious fan service bait like Tharia and Camilla, to the series' most notorious recurring motif of this nature, that of sibling incest subtext. That stuff has been a minor but noticeable aspect of the series' identity since the 90s, and from the earliest days of the Western FE fandom back in the 2000s, most of us have just enjoyed those elements where they personally appealed to us and just sort of shrugged our shoulders at all the rest. It's a common truism that sex sells, and even better for the series' longevity that it can use that kind of content, even when it's considered in poor taste, to set itself apart not just from Nintendo's other largely family-friendly IPs, but from other RPGs and tactics games that either lack that kind of character focus or simply aren't willing to go there, if you will. And Dark Deity isn't willing to go there. It may have some very mild nods towards same-sex relationships here and there, and occasionally some of the characters like Ford and Sia manage to get a little bit bawdy, but it's altogether an exceptionally tame experience. I don't know if that was always how the game was scripted, or if that's partially a reaction to fandom outcry against a certain character's original fan-service-y design, and to be fair, that design was quite ridiculous, even on a practical level. But either way, that's the final product we have, and I can't help but feel a little disappointed. It's harder for me to appreciate either side in that particular debate, as I'm neither a woman nor am I attracted to women, but from my perspective, Fire Emblem's off-color sexual content is that it's most entertaining when it's not obvious at first glance. You wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at their character designs that Lachesis and her brother are represented as star-crossed lovers, or that Dimitri has an ending in which his male partner receives a burial worthy of a royal consort. By tossing out that kind of writing because it got lumped into the same category as designs like Camilla and pre-release Sloane, Dark Deity has weakened its ability to generate lasting appeal to Fire Emblem fans as a whole. It all comes down to a lot of taking the subjective bad with the subjective good. Taking it outside the realm of sexual content for a bit, God knows I can't stand the self-insert avatar characters of recent FE games, and the multi-root derived faction wars of Fates, and especially Three Houses, have led to endless discourse and fracturing in the fandom. But those kinds of things help keep the series going and lead me to enjoy my favorite morsels of gay subtext in my own little corner of the community. Dark Deity has a lot of good to offer and is patching out much of the bad, but when everyone's finished playing it and seen all the bombs and tried out all the classes and customization options and done whatever wacky challenge runs they can dream up, I just can't see much that will bring people back to the game. And that's sad, really. I do hope Sword and Axe LLC keep improving Dark Deity and keep making games, and I do have to admire them for turning their dream of an indie homage to Fire Emblem into a reality. I've had tons of ideas for fan-made FEs over the years that will never see the light of day. Yeah, anyway, props to them all the same. If you play Dark Deity, I'd be interested to know what you think about it. To my knowledge, this is only the second review on YouTube from the perspective of someone who's finished the game. So, safe to say everyone's reactions are still pretty fresh. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you as always for listening, and an extra big thanks to my patrons for helping to make my forays into different types of content possible. If you haven't played Dark Deity and would like to check it out, I put a link to its Steam page in the description. I think it's good enough to warrant at least one playthrough, which I know doesn't sound like a glowing recommendation, but try it out for yourself, form your own opinion. Au revoir!